video, we'll continue looking at the ecology unit and how animals and plants transition to land. So with that, we will begin by talking about the importance of sunlight. Sunlight is the ultimate source for energy and warmth on the earth. It is used to power photosynthesis, of course, and keep the earth warm during all periods. And so that is a very important thing for both plants and animals, because plants obviously to make food, animals because they need to eat the plants or eat the things that eat plants. And light intensity also has something to do with this. This is a little thing that shows the light intensity, how it changes throughout the year, which is just kind of how our seasons are. But you can see where the light is most intense is where you'd expect the most growth of plants in the rainforests and those kinds of areas. And so as we begin talking about how organisms change, we'll start with plants. Plants grow from tissues called meristematic tissues. And these meristematic tissues are almost like stem cells in animals, in that they can kind of become any other kind of cell, and this is where the growth is occurring. And so you have these near the ends, or like the top of the plant and the bottom, and then you also have it along the sides. And what that allows the plant to do also is it allows it to move toward the light. And so this is called phototropism, when plants will move toward the light. And you see here, Darwin did an experiment, it's a pretty famous experiment, in which he showed some different circumstances in which a plant might move or not move away from the light. And what causes phototropism is a particular kind of hormone that is called auxin. And auxin, AUXIN, will actually travel to the dark side of the plant and cause the cells on that dark side of the plant to grow. And that causes the dark side to be longer than the short side, and thus causing the plant to bend toward the light. And so you can see this in any garden. Plants will typically point themselves to where the light is going to be the most intense for the longest period of time, and they will do that so that they can grow the most. Remember, all organisms' goals are to survive and reproduce, plants being no different. And the next thing has to do with when plants flower. And so this has a lot to do with a protein called a phytochrome, which is essentially acting like a biological clock that kind of tells time in a sense. Sunlight causes the shape of that protein to change. Remember, conformational shape change. The shape allows for then the activation of transcription, translation, and the genes associated with that to create flowering. And so this creates two different kinds of flowers, and there's signal transduction for that same idea. And so two kinds of flowers. You have long night plants, and they are what they sound like. They require these long, uninterrupted periods of night in order to flower. And these are going to be found in the fall and winter, because this is when the longest nights are. And you can see here in this picture, it shows you that as long as the days are longer, the plants won't flower. But as soon as the nights get to a particular point, that critical night length is what that's called, then the plants will begin to flower. And notice on the far left, they kind of trick the plant into flower or not flowering by flashing light in the middle of those long nights. And so plants will recognize that and will act accordingly. And so if you have long night flowers, then it would serve to reason that you would also have short night flowers. And these are going to bloom in the spring and the summer, where the nights are shorter, the days are longer, and they still have that critical night length. Once the night gets to a certain amount of time, they will stop blooming, but once the night is shorter and there's more daylight, they will bloom. And you can see there on the right, the trick works in the opposite effect. If you can shine light in the middle of the night, you can actually cause them to bloom early. So next, let's talk about transpiration. Transpiration is the evaporation of water off of the leaves of cells. In particular, there are these tiny little holes called stomata. And stomata have around them cells called guard cells. And just like any guard, they regulate the opening. And these guard cells are regulated by controlling the amount of water that is in them. So if there's a lot of water in them, they will open. If they don't have very much water, they will close. And they do this by actively transporting potassium ions, as you can see right here, into the cell, which that causes a hypertonic environment in the cell, and then water will move from hypo to hyper, as we've learned before, causing those cells to swell, thus causing the opening to open. If the cell needs, or if the leaf needs to close those openings, it will do the exact opposite. It will expel the potassium, thus causing water to chase out after the potassium, thus causing those openings to close. And so if a plant needs to close its openings in order to preserve water, it can do that. If it needs to open them in order to let water out and thus let CO2 in also, don't forget that, then they will do that. So, a little bit next about animals and how they deal with their transition to land. First, we'll talk about osmoregulation and the controlling the amount of water that is in animals. In particular, this has to do with also a waste product that will build up in animals called ammonia. And ammonia can build up because of deamination, which we've learned about before, which is the breakdown of proteins. You have these amino acids, and these two carbons can be used by the Krebs cycle, and you're left with an NH3, which is not good. And so a lot of animals have to deal with this in order to live. And so this comes in lots of different forms. Fish, because they live in the water, they can release theirs directly as ammonia without much problem. A lot of animals convert this ammonia to urea, which is then processed by the kidneys in order to form urine. And then some animals, in order to conserve the most amount of water, will instead create a structure or a substance called uric acid, which is more of a more solid form of this kind of waste. And so all the water is reabsorbed back into the body in order to do that. One ways that animals will stay warm is something called countercurrent heat exchange. And the best way to think about countercurrent heat exchange is, so the middle of an animal is warm, the extremities will tend to be colder, and so that blood coming back to the middle is actually colder because it's been out of those extremities. And then the blood returning to the extremities is warmer because it's coming from the middle. And as that blood crosses paths or runs counter parallel to one another, the warm blood will actually warm the cold blood as it's going back to the center, thus creating so the middle of the body is not cooled down too fast. Obviously, this can't last forever, but it can last long enough to keep these animals alive. And in other types of animals, this is a homeostatic mechanism in that the hypothalamus can detect temperature and then will adjust the body's temperature accordingly. And it does this by controlling metabolism and the rate of metabolism.